Greetings and welcome to week 2 of Humanities 1301. This week we are asking the question, what is steampunk? So let's get into it. Steampunk is the retro-futuristic aesthetic that began as a literary genre and still is one, but has evolved into a fashion aesthetic and has become to many a lifestyle. It is in fact a reality for a growing number of people who've begun to embrace a new form of science fiction and a countercultural movement called steampunk, which looks to both the past that was and the past that never was for inspiration and guidance as to where the future is going and what it might hold. So steampunk reimagines the Victorian era, if you will, through the lenses of Victorian science fiction, as if the fantastical mechanisms and situations in Victorian science fiction had actually existed. Steampunk looks back to the Victorian period in history as a simpler, nobler, and more concretely substantial time. Interestingly, the steampunk movement idealizes the Victorian period in the same way that actual Victorian thinkers idealized the medieval past and also the future into which their technological innovations were propelling them. In turn, steampunk has idealized the science fiction vision of the Victorians. The Victorian medievalist movement romanticized the medieval period, believing it to be a simpler, nobler, more corporeal time. Both movements look to the past as a way to deal with their respective presents. But while the Victorian medievalists look back to the past that, on the whole, actually existed, the steampunk movement looks back to a past that temporally exists and combines it with the past that only existed in the science fiction writings of the Victorians, thus creating a past that never was. So basically, they look at science fiction of the Victorians and they pretend that it was actually real. So it's an interesting concept. But let's keep going. Victorian medievalism and steampunk seek a more human world by looking back to a romanticized past as a model of and for humanity. This also mirrors much of Victorian science fiction's modeling of a vision and desire for a brighter future, though much like science fiction, this is not always the case. Steampunk as a literary genre or a science fiction subgenre has its humble beginnings in the mid-1970s in a dive bar, of all places, in Orange, California, where 3 students and fellow writers often met to discuss and critique each other's fictional works. Tim Powers, James Blaylock, and Jake W. Jeter challenged each other to write stories featuring alternative histories of the Victorian time period. And it was during these discussions that the ideas emerged of writing stories centered in the Victorian time period using implausible or even impossible science. All 3 authors were friends with and influenced by science fiction author Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick was the author of the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the book that the movie series Blade Runner came from. So he's actually fairly important to the science fiction world. Let's see. So Philip K. Dick mentored and encouraged the trio in their efforts, and they in turn influenced Dick, who actually based characters in his own works on Jeter and Powers. In 1987, in a letter to Locus, which is a science fiction magazine, J.W. Jeter described the type of writing that he and Powers and Blaylock were doing as steampunk. He just kind of came up with the term off the cuff. And he described it as an offshoot of cyberpunk, which is another popular science fiction genre of the time. And while the term was used only this single time in a somewhat obscure section of a very specialized science fiction magazine, it became an instant label for describing the science fiction that was being written and set during the Victorian age, using the most abundant source of power at the time, which was steam. While the term steampunk was coined in 1987, it was not completely embraced by writers of the genre until many years later. There's no definitive timeline for what should be considered actual steampunk literature, but there's plenty of material that is considered to inspire the genre. In other words, works by H.G. Wells and Julius Verne and Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft, for example, all Victorian science fiction writers. Current steampunk includes books now written with a neo-Victorian flair by authors such as Cherry Priest and Gail Cargiver and Scott Westerfield. And from this wealth of steampunk literature, a new subculture has spawned, one that deeply identifies with steampunk, figuring widely in role-playing games, video games, cosplay, and even sci-fi con culture, more generally speaking. The steampunk movement is easy to recognize, but is rather difficult to define precisely. In other words, you'll know what you're looking at when you see it, and you'll be able to say, that's steampunk. But when somebody asks you, can you define steampunk? It might be a little bit harder. So it has been variously defined as a subculture that embraces the simplicity and romance of the past, and at the same time couples it with the hope and promise and the sheer super coolness of futuristic design. But also, it's been defined as a science fiction subgenre that postulates a fictional event of vast consequences. For example, if Charles Babbage's computing difference engine had actually been produced, or if the American Civil War had lasted for a decade longer than the 4 years it actually did last. In the past, the various consequences of the past have, changes. Actually, lost my train of thought there for a second. So it postulates a fictional event of vast consequences. So if the Civil War hadn't stopped when it did, or if other things hadn't been produced, and it extrapolates from that event a fictional, though historically contingent, present or future. In other words, it completely gives an alternate history based on a future that never was. It's a little complicated, but hang in there with me. All right, let's keep going. While there are several somewhat different definitions of what steampunk is for our purposes, steampunks will be defined as a movement which emulates, incorporates, and glorifies the Victorian style and period, and which embraces steam machine technology as empowering to humanity, while using Victorian technology as in an implausible manner beyond its actual achievements. In other words, using steam-powered machinery, steampunk will take Victorian tech, basically steam-powered machinery, and the ideas that were in science fiction, Victorian science fiction at the time, and use them in ways that they were never intended to be used. Further, this technology must be mechanical in a strict sense. There must be levers, cogs, gears, sprockets. They're all important to the aesthetic as they provide the animus to the machine. In other words, it's a machine that has moving parts, lots of them usually. This animus, or life-giving force, this movement, is important to steampunks. They usually reject the modern electronic age and the products of it precisely because those products lack the animating spirit. Also, in spite of its idolization of Victoriana, steampunk usually rejects more unattractive facets of Victorian culture, such as racism and imperialism. Those are not held with great esteem, mostly because of our modern sensibilities, where we don't hold racism and imperialism with great esteem. Motion, again, is the important thing to steampunk, as it is a humanizing force. It's like a spark of life. Many steampunks feel that modern devices, particularly those of the electronic age, are sterile. The modern computer sitting still is capable of many fantastic applications, but it is dull. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't really make any noise, which is probably why the uh, colorful LED movement, the RGB, has it's RGB. I'm sure I always say that wrong. You know, where our computers have all the bells and whistles and the LED lights. Trust me, mine does. So it's kind of why we like that, I think, because it shows our computers are doing something. They're not just sitting there silently on the desk. We know they're doing something intellectually, but all the lights make it really look like they're doing something. From a distance, no one can tell what a computer is doing or if it's doing anything at all. In addition, all computers essentially look the same. The minor differences between them have very little aesthetic meaning and virtually no functional ones. For example, laptop computers share the same fold-over design, the same structure of interfaces and output media. The differences in thickness, color, and weight are extremely subtle and usually have no direct impact on the laptop's function or usefulness. And steampunks will see beauty in a giant steam shovel or a battleship or a dirigible or even more fanciful things like giant bronze robots or underwater trains and flying aircraft carriers. But they don't see the beauty in the sterile gray box sitting almost silently on a desk. Which doesn't mean that they don't appreciate modern technology. They just feel like it needs some pizzazz. The physicality of machine ties them inexorably to the world, and their construction by man ties them to humanity. In other words, the fact that the machines are huge and exist and they move, it makes them very much of this world, and that they were made by man it just ties them to humanity. It's something humans did. Let's see. Therefore, the sterile technology of modern design, being removed from the material world, breaks its connection with humanity, making the users of it also in some way less human. It's kind of that disconnect that many of us experienced during the lockdowns. We are still humans. There's a human on the other side of the computer talking to you, but without being able to actually see them or be in the same room with them or know that they're alive, do we know that it's an actual human? And that is actually getting harder and harder to tell. So steampunks are driven to find ways to fuse objects and themes of the past with those of the present, so as to satisfy their need to connect and reconnect with the people and the world around them, while simultaneously rejecting most of the popular fads and fashions in both lifestyle and literary genre. In this class, we're going to take a look at steampunk as a science fiction and countercultural movement and explore how it draws on the various movements in speculative fiction that originated in the Victorian era, which is what steampunk idolizes. And if you didn't know what steampunk was before you joined this class, I cannot promise you that you will know exactly what it is when you leave, but you will be able to recognize it when you see it. We're going to examine many of the different aspects of the humanities, namely art, music, cinema, fashion, and literature, through the various lenses of steampunk. First, we'll focus on the inspiration for steampunk was, namely the Victorians, and how the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century gave rise to the Victorians and many of the traditions and habits of Western civilization that we still have today. We're going to take a look at the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the Victorians in next week's lesson. For this week, however, let's take a quick look. For this week, please read the introduction, chapter 1 and chapter 2 in our textbook, Steampunk FAQ by Mike Prashon. And I'm asking you to do questions and comments on the discussion board. So be sure that you have 3 questions and comments for each chapter. So 3 questions and comments for the introduction, 3 for chapter 1, and 3 for chapter 2. And don't forget to reply to 2 other classmates' posts to have a complete post on your discussion board. There's a couple videos that I have up here that will help you understand a little bit more about the steampunk movement. And since it's a visual, it's kind of nice. Beyond the Gears, the steampunk movement actually takes you to a steampunk event and talks to various people throughout it and shows off the costuming and asks them what they think steampunk is. And they give some very honest answers. And it's kind of interesting. The second video I'd like for you guys to watch is When Your Friend Goes Steampunk. It's a Key and Peele skit. There is a bit of censored language in it, but it's actually adds to the humor of it. And I think that it truly brings some clarity and levity to this topic. And I think it's one of the most honest portrayals I've seen of what happens when your friend suddenly decides that they're very interested in the steampunk movement. There are a couple other assignments as well this week. The first one being, what does steampunk mean to me? Now, this is simply a reflection piece. Hopefully after you've gone through the chapters 1 and 2, and maybe watch the videos, think about it and kind of give me a paragraph about what you think steampunk is. What does it mean to you? Does it look interesting? Does it look scary? Does it look like something only weird or cult-like people might be into? Or does the do-it-yourself feel of the aesthetic appeal to you? Were you already familiar with steampunk? Maybe you were. Maybe you got into this class because you were familiar with steampunk. Maybe you're looking forward to learning more. Either way, just let me know what you think about it, whether you think it's something you might enjoy or if you're just kind of just trying to get through the class. Either way, there's no right or wrong answer in this one. Simply, again, just a reflection piece, but an important piece of the homework. And then finally, I wanted to introduce to you guys the final steampunk project proposal. Now, if you'll recall from last week, we have 2 events, well, an event and a project proposal. The cultural event, found here in the left side menu, tells you all about, right here, the cultural event here. This assignment tells you all about what you can do, several different options for the cultural event that you must do. So be sure to be thinking about that. But also, we have over here the final project. And this will be up, this has been up, and it will be up for the entirety of the course. The project proposal, I have it due fairly early on because I really want you to give it some thought. I want you to tell me what you think you would like to do for your steampunk project, your final project. Be sure to read through the description here of the final steampunk project, and then you'll be turning in this project proposal next week. You're not locked into this proposal. If you turn in a proposal for one thing and then decide later that you want to do something else, that's fine. I have you do this early on, like I said, to get you started thinking about it, to know that I have attempted to, light a fire under it. So that will also be due. And then finally, I wanted to show you our steampunk novel. Now, we're going to be reading a steampunk novel, and we're going to be reading an actual novel by H.G. Wells. We're going to be reading The Time Machine, and that is Victorian science fiction. And you do need to start reading it now. You can find it here in the novels. There's a PDF of it. It's 148 pages on the PDF. If you are able to find a copy of it someplace else and you'd like to read it, please do so. Most copies are the same. I don't completely recommend only the audiobook simply because you'll need to reference back to a copy of it. So maybe you can reference back to this copy or another book if you have one, if you'd like a different copy of that, because you will be writing a paper over it and you're going to have to be able to reference it back. But you need to start reading the book now. We will be discussing this in week 5. So that's about 3 or 4 weeks from now. So do start reading it now. Again, that's The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. The link is here. Or if you'd rather get your own copy of it, that's fine too, but you do need to start reading it. And I do warn you that it will take you a minute to get into, because this was written by a Victorian for Victorians. And while it is still in the King's English that we use today, they have a very different way of phrasing things. So it will take you a couple minutes and a little bit of reading to actually get into the story and, I guess, get used to the peculiarities of the speech patterns. Much like if you were to try and pick up Shakespeare, it would take you a minute to read Shakespeare to try to understand it. So don't give up. Don't get discouraged. It's not difficult. It's just different. So do give yourself plenty of time to read that. All right. And as always, I want to also show you the discussion board here. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to go over here to the general Q&A discussion board and ask your question. I monitor this. I try to get to those and answer those as soon as I can. You as a student, if you see somebody asking a question there and you know the answer, you are also welcome to answer it. I will correct you if I have to, but I like the idea of everybody being able to communicate with each other there. So that's going to do it for week 2. Got quite a bit here in front of you. Like I said, you can ask a question in the discussion board there. You can send me an email. Please don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions. All right, and have a great week.